What if the people who claimed to love you were quietly planning to take everything from you? Welcome to a story where control hides behind care. Marriage turns into a transaction, and silence becomes a weapon. This isn't just about a difficult mother-in-law or a distant husband. It's about how loyalty can be sold, how trust can be signed away on paper, and how patience can be mistaken for weakness. Here, every smile has a motive, every promise has fine print, and every betrayal leaves a trail. But this is also a story about power shifting, about what happens when those who manipulate believe they've won, only to discover they underestimated the one person they never saw coming. If you're drawn to real stories of family drama, hidden secrets, emotional survival, and calculated revenge, you're exactly where you need to be. Care was the word used most often. Every decision came wrapped in it, every restriction justified by it. The tone was soft, almost loving, when the suggestion came to stop working for a while, just until the family settled. Finances were merged for security. Documents were held for safekeeping. Traditions were enforced as protection, not control. That was the story told at the dinner table, with gentle smiles and rules disguised as blessings. What slipped away first was choice. Small freedoms vanished under polite pressure. Clothes were corrected, friends were questioned, time was managed by someone else's schedule. Each concern raised was met with a reminder of gratitude owed. Family values, it was said, required sacrifice. Resistance meant selfishness. Silence was rewarded with approval. The most unsettling part wasn't her confidence, it was his quiet compliance. Promises once spoken privately were replaced with rehearsed lines learned at home. When finances disappeared into accounts that couldn't be accessed, there was no outrage, only reassurance. When personal belongings were boxed away, there was no defense, only logic. When dignity was chipped down by advice, there was no protection, only averted eyes. Loyalty had shifted without warning, and love was now conditional on obedience. The mask slipped during paperwork nights. Forms appeared that moved assets away, signatures expected without explanation. Questions were treated like betrayal. Hesitation earned lectures about unity. Behind closed doors, a different truth surfaced. Debts hidden before marriage, money borrowed and never mentioned, promises made to someone else long before vows were spoken. The silence wasn't confusion, it was strategy. Care became surveillance. Messages were monitored, calls were questioned, decisions required approval. The house felt smaller every day, not because of walls, but because autonomy had no place there. Meanwhile, he learned to translate her commands into gentle requests, as if control sounded kinder in his voice. The betrayal cut deeper with each discovery. Conversations overheard, plans made without consent, a future negotiated by two people while the third was expected to comply quietly. The man who vowed partnership had already chosen sides, trading respect for comfort and calling it peace. Endurance looked like agreement. Agreement bought time. Time revealed everything that care was never meant to hide. And the moment control mistook silence for surrender was the moment it began to fail. Love was presented as equal, but the marriage ran on quiet transactions. Affection came with expectations. Security came with conditions. The moment vows were exchanged, numbers began to matter more than promises. Conversations about the future drifted toward assets, not dreams, and every plan seemed already approved by someone else. Trust cracked open the night a folder was left on the table by mistake. Inside were documents transferring property that once belonged to family, signed weeks earlier without discussion. Questions followed, calm at first, then sharper. The explanation arrived rehearsed, temporary, necessary for stability. The words sounded practiced, like a script learned long before marriage existed. What wasn't said spoke louder. Inheritance meant for protection had been redirected. Accounts once mentioned casually were suddenly empty. Investments described as joint turned out to be pledged elsewhere. Each discovery peeled back another layer of truth. Love hadn't disappeared, it had been leveraged. Marriage wasn't partnership, it was access. The most painful realization wasn't the missing money, it was understanding where loyalty lived. Private conversations revealed debts hidden before vows, promises made to family that outweighed marital commitment, a future negotiated in advance with one person assumed to comply silently. When confronted, eyes didn't harden, they avoided. Guilt didn't surface, defensiveness did. Betrayal wasn't accidental, it was organized. Affection became currency. Warmth appeared when compliance followed. Distance arrived when questions were asked. Every disagreement was reframed as disrespect, every concern labeled emotional. Meanwhile, assets continued shifting hands quietly, each signature tightening the trap. Love letters were replaced by legal language, anniversaries overshadowed by deadlines. The home felt less like a refuge and more like collateral. And still, the betrayal deepened. Phone calls ended abruptly when footsteps approached. Messages were deleted. Stories changed slightly each time they were told. The truth landed in fragments. Property transferred to protect others, inheritance absorbed to settle old obligations, marriage used as a shield against consequences. Loyalty had never been divided, it had already been assigned elsewhere. Silence became observation. Observation uncovered patterns. Patterns exposed intent. What looked like neglect revealed itself as calculation. When the final document appeared, waiting for one last signature, the meaning was clear. Love had been spent, trust had been traded, and the marriage, built on hidden betrayals, stood on borrowed ground. That signature never came, and everything that followed did. Endurance became the safest language in a house where resistance carried consequences. Every slight was swallowed carefully, every insult disguised as humor accepted with a practiced calm. Humiliation arrived often, corrected opinions in public, mocked boundaries in private, decisions overturned without warning. Each moment burned, but none were wasted. Memory sharpened where dignity was tested. Patience wasn't weakness, it was observation. Documents left unattended were photographed mentally before being returned to their places. Bank statements glanced at too quickly revealed patterns that didn't match explanations. Dates didn't line up, transfers repeated themselves with quiet precision. Lies were told softly, always close to the truth but never touching it. Each one was stored away, not for confrontation, but for clarity. The husband mistook silence for acceptance. Confidence grew with every unchallenged demand. Stories became sloppier, excuses contradicted one another. Late nights increased, phone calls lowered in volume. A name appeared often enough to become familiar without ever being introduced. The marriage existed on the surface, but loyalty was clearly invested elsewhere. What hurt most wasn't cruelty, it was calculation. Apologies were offered only when useful. Affection appeared strategically, timed to smooth over questions or redirect suspicion. Promises were made to delay, not to keep. Meanwhile, assets continued shifting, responsibility continued dodging, and accountability remained a foreign concept. The man who spoke of unity lived a double life built on convenience. Endurance learned the rhythm of the household, which days documents moved, which nights calls came late, which stories were told to whom. Every detail formed a pattern too deliberate to ignore. Patience allowed access to truths that anger would have shut down. The turning point wasn't explosive, it was quiet. A single discovery connected every loose end, proof that betrayal wasn't emotional alone, but financial, legal, intentional. What was once suspected became undeniable. The marriage wasn't crumbling, it had been hollow from the start, sustained only by manipulation and silence. Still, nothing changed outwardly. Smiles remained, compliance continued. The illusion stayed intact because storms don't announce themselves. They gather pressure slowly, invisibly, until escape is impossible. When the moment finally arrived, it wouldn't need shouting or begging. Every copied page, every remembered word, every noted lie would speak clearly enough. And the patience that was mistaken for surrender was about to become impossible to ignore. Power didn't arrive with raised voices or dramatic entrances. It came quietly, carried by someone the family never bothered to measure correctly. For years, assumptions filled the room, that control was permanent, that silence meant weakness, that nothing existed beyond their reach. Those assumptions became their blind spot. The first meeting felt ordinary to them. Polite greetings, calm expressions, a conversation they believed would end with reassurance and compliance. What they didn't realize was that every document they had hidden, every transfer justified with lies, every asset quietly taken, had already been traced back to its origin. The truth didn't need emotion, it needed records. Questions were asked gently at first, each one precise. Dates, signatures, authority, ownership. Confidence drained with every answer that didn't align. The husband shifted in his seat, suddenly unsure of the stories he'd been repeating for years. The woman who thrived on dominance interrupted often, only to be met with silence that refused to bend. Then the evidence surfaced. Property claimed his family owned was proven otherwise. Inheritance redirected without consent was legally challenged. Accounts emptied under false nobility were documented line by line. Every betrayal that had been dismissed as misunderstanding now stood exposed under scrutiny that didn't rely on intimidation. The husband's secrets unraveled fastest. Hidden debts surfaced, tied to decisions made long before marriage. Agreements signed behind closed doors emerged, revealing promises to others that explained his silence, his compliance, his willingness to sacrifice trust for convenience. Loyalty wasn't confused, it had been sold. For the first time, control shifted. Voices that once commanded now pleaded, excuses replaced confidence. The power dynamic cracked as consequences appeared, legal, financial, irreversible. What had been taken methodically was now being reclaimed with the same precision. There was no satisfaction in their panic, only clarity. The man who had stood aside for so long finally spoke, not in defense, but in confession. The truth poured out once the illusion of dominance collapsed. Every choice made out of fear, every betrayal justified as necessity, every moment of silence exposed as self-preservation. The underestimated presence didn't raise a voice. There was no need. Authority came from preparation, not aggression. The outcome had already been decided long before that meeting began. What remained afterward was quiet. Control lost its grip. Lies lost their shelter. And the marriage, stripped of secrets and manipulation, stood exposed for what it had always been. They never saw that power coming, and by the time they did, it was far too late. If this story pulled you in, imagine what's coming next. These are the kinds of truths that stay hidden until it's too late, and stories that deserve to be told. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story where silence turns into strength and betrayal meets its consequences. Thank you for listening, and remember, not all storms are loud.